Hello, good evening, everyone, and I am so glad you are here with us this evening. I'm Linnell Stevens, Village Preservation's Director of Development, and I'm delighted to be co-hosting this evening's event with my colleague Hugh Evans, and of course tonight's incredible speaker, author and artist, Steven Naifeh. I just want to first share a little bit of information about our organization. Some of you have heard this before, but I'm going to say it again because I love to. Village Preservation has been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 more programs a year, just like the one you're about to see. And most of these programs are free and open to the public. We're very proud of that. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth of our communities and the value of preservation. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us, really. To learn more about us, go to our website, villagepreservation.org, and please do consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able to at villagepreservation.org/donate, which I am going to drop in the chat right now for your convenience. Thank you so much. All right, so now a tiny bit of Zoom protocol. Please feel free to use the chat function to say hi and tell us where you're joining us from, or to tell us your thoughts. And if you have any questions for our speaker tonight, please use the Q&A function within the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. It helps to keep track of the questions so that you can ask a question at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many of them as we can after the program. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Hugh, who will introduce this evening's esteemed speaker. Thank you so much.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be speaking with Steven Naifeh, who is a renowned American biographer as well as contemporary artist, whose geometric abstractions, many large in scale, have been exhibited widely throughout the world over a period of 45 years. During his undergraduate studies at Princeton and his graduate research at Harvard, Naifeh focused on 19th and 20th century Western European and American art, broadening his understanding of the spectrum of material culture created throughout the ages. Naifeh's artistic imagination has been the driving force not only in his life as an artist, but also of his career as an accomplished writer. His 1989 biography, Jackson Pollock, An American Saga, written with his partner, Gregory White Smith, comprises 8 years of research on Pollock and interviews with over 850 people, unlocking a never-before-seen exploration of the artist's journey filled with piercing psychological insights. His research brings us to a truer understanding of the power and pathos of a creative genius. The biography also won a Pulitzer Prize and was the basis for the Oscar-winning film Pollock, made in 2000. So Steve, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We'd love to hear more about your experience writing the book and maybe share a few of your stories.
Should I start with the writing of the book and then talk about the village and Pollock's role in it?
Yes, please.
Well, there have, since we wrote Pollock, been quite a few really significant biographies of artists, including Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan's biography of de Kooning, and more recently of Francis Bacon, and many others. I mean, Magritte just came out, but when we were beginning work, there really weren't a lot of biographies of artists. They tended to be books like Alfred Barr's book, which tended to talk about the art in the absence of the life, and so the huge advantage for us was that a towering figure like Jackson Pollock had not been really addressed in a really significant way. It was inconceivable that a political figure or a literary figure or a military figure of that magnitude had not been rather significantly addressed by somebody else. We began soon after Robert Caro's biography of Robert Moses came out, and actually the first volume of Johnson. I don't know how many of you have read these books, but I think there's quite a chance that many of you have. If you haven't, they're spectacular. And Johnson was born about the same year that Pollock was born, and therefore how Caro approached Johnson became a kind of model for our way of dealing with Jackson, because most of the people that Jackson, who were significant to Jackson in his lifetime, unfortunately not his brother Sandy, but all three other brothers, his widow Lee Krasner, and dozens of friends were still alive. And they were also, importantly, sort of past the high point of their careers, and they were sort of a little bit retired. And therefore, they sort of welcomed sitting down and talking about their memories. And so we had this incredibly exciting experience of sitting down with these significant people, and meaning significant in the sense that they had had a key role in, many of them, in the development of abstract expressionism. If not, they had known Jackson really well, or had some significant interaction with him. And we tape recorded all of the, or virtually all of the conversations. And Greg and I, my partner and co-author, likened it to archaeology. We were sort of constantly digging, but constantly finding things too. And almost every day we would find something that had not appeared in print because it was mostly an oral history. That was also a factor. Another factor for having to do oral history was that Jackson could write rather nicely in a letter. I mean, he could write sort of emotionally, but there were almost no letters. There were a few postcards. Most of them were, like, please buy me some more paint. But he wrote a couple of meaningful letters to his brother Charles and to his father, but they were very limited, unlike Van Gogh, who of course famously left this huge body of letters to not only to Theo, but to some other people as well. So it made our task easier that there wasn't a vast literature on Pollock, and there wasn't a whole lot of biographical literature, but we had the family correspondence. There were, even though there were not a lot of letters by Jackson, there were a lot of letters about Jackson from one family member to another. It was very much like the Van Gogh family correspondence, where in both cases, because the artist was the sort of troubled child in the family, so most of the family correspondence in both cases was about Jackson on the one hand and Vincent on the other are in trouble again. What are we as a family going to do about it? How can we handle this? And in fact, in both cases, in Vincent's case, they thought about having him committed to an insane asylum. In Jackson's case, he was self-committed to an alcoholic rehabilitation center. So the combination of this rather detailed family correspondence and this really rich oral history made it possible to really reconstitute Jackson's life. It was sort of sad to be in his head, as it later was in Vincent's, because Jackson was not a happy person. He was a very significant alcoholic. Clement Greenberg once referred to him as an alcoholic in excelsis, and he really didn't know if he had any skill until really quite late, and even then he was constantly doubting himself, and there were opportunities for self-doubt even after he'd become famous, and Clement Greenberg generated the line that made possible the Life magazine article that called him the greatest living artist, although he put a question mark at the end of that title, is he the greatest living artist? Greenberg sort of dropped him. So there was never a sense that he was fully there, even though the paintings began to sell for a fair amount of money for the time, um, uh, Blue Poles sold, if I remember correctly, for several $1,000s, but the sales were not regular. So they were, and because they liked, Jackson inherited from his mother a taste for a kind of fine life. So when he did make some money from selling a painting, he would go and buy 5 suits, and they wanted the best cuts of meat from the grocer in East Hampton, and they were always facing they being Jackson and Lee Krasner, financial difficulties. Different people came along. Alfonso Osorio helped a bit, but it was a struggle. And but he, one of the things that made it easier to write about him was that he was never alone. He really couldn't handle living by himself. So he lived with his family until he moved to New York, and he immediately started living with his brother Charles. And then when Charles's wife couldn't take it any longer, they handed him over to Sandy, his next oldest brother. And Sandy and Arloy shouldered the considerable and difficult responsibility of taking care of him until Arloy couldn't take it anymore. And she wanted to have a child, and she was absolutely determined that she wouldn't have a child with Jackson in the apartment. At which point Lee showed up, and then Lee took care of him until the very end, when, as many of you probably know, the marriage began to come apart, but only in the last couple of months, when Lee went off to Europe and he was left with Ruth Kligman in East Hampton. And even then he wasn't completely alone, because Ruth was in and out, but there were times when there was almost always somebody there, and therefore we could see it, Jackson, through their eyes. One of the other things that we realized early on is that in art history at the time, what people really cared about was what some other famous artist had to say about another famous artist. So, for example, people assumed that what Robert Motherwell had to say about Jackson, especially because Motherwell was so articulate and wrote so beautifully and was so highly educated, counted more than lesser known people, when in fact, Motherwell really didn't know him. And Jackson, to the extent that he had people he was close to, many of those people were not famous. And so it was finding the right people out of those 850. For example, with Lee Krasner, she had been interviewed a lot and was sort of cagey and a little bit paranoid, rightfully, because she was always angry when people didn't quote her the way she thought she should be quoted. And so we spoke with her, but she was mildly helpful. But far more helpful was Ruth Stein, her sister, who was a terrific storyteller and raconteur and had an iron grip of a memory and could sort of tell the stories of their life together. And she also knew Jackson pretty well. She would visit them in East Hampton, and Jackson on one occasion described a painting and the meaning of it to Ruth Stein in one of the few times we know where Jackson actually described the essence of a painting. It was Portrait in a Dream, a painting that's essentially of his mother on the left-hand side of the painting and himself on the right side of the painting, something we know because Ruth told us about this. And you can sort of see it now that we knew that. You can sort of see it in similar images that he did of himself and of her. But because we don't have a lot of firsthand accounts from him, and because he said so little about what he was doing and what was going on in the art, one of the real challenges was trying to understand the art from the inside, something that was infinitely easier with Vincent van Gogh, because he wrote these hundreds and hundreds of letters that were incredibly articulate, and he was a terrific writer. We often thought that even if he had never become a painter, he would have been important as a writer. Another person who sort of was a little bit like that was Thomas Hart Benton, who was Jackson's principal teacher when he came to New York, and really mentor and sort of surrogate father. And Benton wrote beautifully. I mean, so I'll give you an example of how the kinds of things that emerged. I went to Kansas City to interview some people who knew Benton, including a lawyer who was sort of a friend of his and became his executor. And on the way out of the interview, the lawyer says, would you be interested? Benton wrote an autobiography, and it was never published, but you think you might be interested in this? Well, it was an incredible document with lots of details that were not in the literature. Another similar situation emerged with Arloy McCoy, Sandy's wife, his older brother Sandy's wife, who wrote a short story or a short book about the Pollock family's early life together, called the short steps and the low steps and the high steps, referring to the heights of the 5 boys. And they were basically Sandy's recollections from his childhood, many of them about Jackson. And so even though Sandy wasn't there, it was as if he came back from the dead to help us understand his brother. I want to leave enough time for questions. I could certainly go on about the excitement of doing this. The other exciting thing was working with Greg Smith. I mean, Greg had a brain tumor, which was triggered when he was 22. So he had this brain tumor the whole time we were together, and he died in 2014. One of the amazing things was that he was often in the hospital. He had 13 brain surgeries, so he was often in the hospital when he was working on drafts of the book. It was heroic, but it was also, I mean, we came away wondering, how does anybody write a biography on their own? I mean, and I think Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan experienced the same sort of joy of working together, because while you're doing it, there's no one who's as interested in the topic as you are. And so to have somebody at the end of the day to discuss the subject with, and to compare notes and to talk about, I mean, we would spend an hour or two at the end of every day to sort of to sort of ask, where were we in this process? What did we learn? What new information had emerged? What kind of issues? Because Greg did most of the writing. What kind of issues was he facing, and what kind of information did he need? So I feel we couldn't have felt luckier to be working on a person of his magnitude, who really met all the criteria of a biographical subject, especially a biography of an artist, in the sense that he was, especially if you want to when you want to write a book as long as Pollock was, it's almost 1,000 pages, and people are not going to read 1,000 pages about a minor artist, and yet you can't really develop and understand the complex character of someone in a much shorter book. So fortunately for us, Jackson was incredibly important, which was one of the criteria. He had an enormous influence on the artists who came after him, which was certainly a criterion. His life was incredibly interesting. It doesn't matter if the person's important and had a lot of influence if the life was sort of tedious, but Jackson's was anything but tedious. And also, you really only want to give that much treatment to a subject if the life helps illuminate the art, which it certainly did for both Jackson and later when we took up our second subject, Van Gogh. The life was incredibly important to understanding the art. The other criteria was, is there enough information? And again, because we began early enough that we started interviewing in 1981, I believe, people, so many, I mean, virtually, there were a handful of people who were gone, but most everybody was still alive. So there was plenty of material. If we needed to know something about an event in Jackson's life, there was somebody out there almost always to interview and to find the information that we needed. Because this is the Village Preservation Organization, let me address the importance of the village to Jackson. He because he was such a difficult person, a couple of his psychiatrists spoke to us, which was stunning. One was in Switzerland, and apparently we were just stunned that she would talk to us, given doctor-patient confidentiality. But she was 91, although completely coherent, and she diagnosed him as borderline schizophrenic. And she saw him for quite a few years and was a significant person. Jackson met her through Carolyn Pratt, who was one of the two principals of I believe it was called Country Day there in the Village, who were like mother figures for Pollock, because his own mother was so withholding of affection, and was so complicated herself. He was, and yet on the other hand, was so present in his life. And because he was her favorite, in a sense, he was the baby in the family. When she was not there, he was constantly looking for mother figures, and they certainly played that role. Another woman who played that role was Rita Benton, Thomas Hart Benton's wife, who was known. In fact, one of her niece said she was the great, I can't remember the exact wording, but basically she was the great mother, and she mothered everybody. And Pollock he would babysit their young son. He became part of the musical group that Benton founded. He studied at the Art Students League with Benton, and as in so many times in his life, he went there to the Art Students League to study with Benton because his brother Charles was Benton's favorite artist. And it didn't take long for Jackson to rearrange the dynamics and make himself Benton's favorite student. And in fact, Benton used Pollock as a model. There are several figures in the New School murals that are now at the Met that are Jackson Pollock. There's a laborer who's sort of using a large crowbar in a foundry that's is somewhat recognizable as Pollock, although Benton was using him more as a type than as a subject. But because he was, first of all, he drank too much, and because he almost needed alcohol to facilitate interactions with people, except a very small number that made him feel comfortable. He in a world in which the community was dense with ties and with activity, and these artists were constantly in each other's lives. They socialized, they worked together, they mounted exhibitions together, they had studios together. For instance, Milton Resnick, who was a fantastic interview subject and a great artist, had a studio with de Kooning at one point. And Jackson sort of missed all that. He went to the Cedar Bar, but he was drunk there. And so the connections were not as happy or as productive as they would otherwise have been. Luckily, Lee came into his life and made possible, she sort of connected him indirectly to that world. So to the extent that Pollock was a part of that community, it was really through her. I've got a terrible coughing situation, which I apologize. So if I cough, I do apologize. But he was down there in the village.
If you need a break there and some water, please go right ahead. I've got a couple of questions for you if you want to.
Do you want to go into questions? I mean, there were other.
Anything you'd like to do. I was going to just say, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
There were other things that happened down there. There was an artist named Joe Delaney. There weren't many portraits of Jackson, but there was a Greenwich Village street fair, and Joe Delaney did this incredibly poignant drawing of Jackson at that street fair. He lived with Lee Krasner in the village. He lived with his brother Sandy in the village. He lived with Charles in the village, and so he was down there. And I've thought, for most of those artists, being part of a community was significant. As I was thinking about this, I thought, a question that I think many of you may have wondered, and that is, why are there sometimes small groups of people, small communities that are sort of become dominant forces with a significant number of artists? I'm thinking of Renaissance Florence. I'm thinking of Paris at the end of the 19th century, and certainly New York in the middle of the 20th century. And I think the community helps explain it, meaning that if people are right now in the United States, the artists are all over everywhere, and they may know each other, but it isn't a single community. I think the fact that these other places did have a single community help explain why there's so many great artists in Paris at the end of the 19th century, in Renaissance Florence, or America in the middle of the 20th century. But Pollock operated somewhat independently of that, which may help explain, or it's certainly relevant, that his art was somewhat disconnected from what the other artists were doing. De Kooning's art, everybody was trying to be de Kooning. So many of the artists really imitated de Kooning as the launching point for their own individual styles. And that was partly because de Kooning was such a likable guy. He was charming, is beyond all get out. I mean, he would constantly compliment. One artist said he would come to your house and you might have 10 things on the wall. He would zero in on something you had done and spend the whole evening complimenting, even if the artist was a minor artist. And there was something in the sort of painterly nature of what he was doing that as several artists explained, gave you something you could work with as you began to try to make your own style. The drip technique really there was not a lot you could do with it without basically recapitulating Pollock. But I think that sort of gives the sense of what happened in the village with Jackson. So let me answer some of the questions you might have, Lana.
Sure, of course. I was just going to say, you started to talk about Lee a little bit, and Lee Krasner, and I'd kind of like to understand a little bit more about how she operated as a conduit for him into that society of those.
She, first of all, she gave him, beyond being a conduit, she gave him the psychological stability to even work. I mean, if it hadn't been for her mothering of him, there's a famous line when asked why she wouldn't have a child, and she said, "I have enough of a child in him." And so she did that. He was incapable of making the kind of connections to sell art. So she was the one who cultivated Clement Greenberg, who was so important to his career. She cultivated the dealers, or tried to repair the damage when Jackson did something terrible. It was I don't think, no, it was, I can't remember which dealer it was, but Jackson they went over for dinner, and Jackson just trashed the house. I mean, he broke the furniture, and what I'm saying, that Jackson was incapable of doing this on his own. Just imagine what came out of that. And so Lee was but she also introduced him, and in her own way, even though he was inarticulate. I mean, one of the things that was so interesting about Jackson, and his psychiatrist, his 90-year-old Swiss psychiatrist, told me this. She said, "You're not going to be able to comprehend that someone could be brilliant but not articulate, and that whose brilliance, because you go to school, you went to school and you read books and you write books, your idea of intelligence has something to do with the written word." Pollock didn't have that, and Lee wasn't all that articulate either, to tell you the truth. So they developed a kind of shorthand in which they could communicate almost with grunts. I mean, they would go to an exhibition, and I don't know, Greg and I ended up doing that, even though we were writers. We'd go to, if we went to an exhibition together, we wouldn't sit and analyze each painting. We'd basically murmur something about how wonderful something is. Yeah, exactly. And then many of you may be more verbal than we were, but they could go to an exhibition, say of a Picasso exhibition, and their taste was so similar, and their intelligence was dynamic enough that they communicated a lot. So she brought to his attention a lot of artistic movements that he might not have otherwise known. Picasso, especially.
I'm reminded, by the way, of I'm reminded about something about Ginger Rogers. When they talk about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, yeah, she did everything he did, except for she did it backwards and in high heels. And I think about that when I think about Lee Krasner.
Well, one of the interesting things that I think was at the periphery of your question, and that is, where did she place relative to his art? And first of all, because he was so troubled, he was incredibly paranoid about competition. So one of the questions is, did she paint consistently during their marriage? And we came away from conversations with a lot of people who knew them who said it was essentially a complete stop. At one point, he made it clear that life with him was going to be impossible if she didn't stop painting. So
really,
yeah, so that's how, as supportive as she was for him, he did not return the favor. And he wasn't altogether an attractive human being. And but Lee was madly in love with him, and she understood what a great painter he was. Although she wasn't the first one to notice it. There was a woman named Mercedes Matter who was married to Herbert Matter, the photographer, and she was a teacher in the Village, I believe. And when Lee started seeing Jackson romantically, Mercedes was in the apartment and saw some of Jackson's canvases and was really blown away. And that was really the beginning of Lee understanding that he wasn't just what she later called the sexiest person on two legs, but but also that was the attraction was originally sexual and romantic. It was only later that she realized this guy was the great genius, partly because she came out of the Hoffman School. She also introduced Jackson to all the lessons of the Hoffman School and to the whole community. She was a little mover and shaker back then, and she herself addressed the issue of where she. First of all, I think she was. It's hard to say she's underrated anymore because she's really come into her own.
She
painting
has.
sold for $10 million.
I agree. Yeah, she is.
She's, she sells regularly for very high sums. She had the great exhibition that went to Bilbao and other places. So I don't think we can call her underrated now. I think she was for a very long time. Her attitude was that she wasn't as great an artist as Jackson, but that she was at least as good as most of the male painters other than Jackson and de Kooning. And so I think that's a very fair. Yeah, I agree. I think she's in some ways a more interesting painter than Robert Motherwell, for example. I can make some enemies saying that, but I think she's one of the significant artists of that period. Most of the significant art was done after Jackson died, and basically she took over his studio in East Hampton, and she took over to some extent early on his painting style. A lot of the first really great paintings by Lee Krasner come out of a painting called Easter and the Totem by Jackson. But most of these artists came out of somebody. It doesn't detract from her achievement that she used the achievement of another artist as a launching point for her own style. I mean, think of the number of artists who began with de Kooning and who achieved a lot. I could go.
And as you were saying earlier, sorry to interrupt, but just communities of artists in the different forms that we found them throughout the world, throughout times, that they've contributed to one another's aesthetic.
Absolutely.
And you see that, and you point out that Jackson was isolated and apart from the whole aesthetic of the Cedar Tavern people. But it was so interesting that there at the Cedar Tavern, you had visual artists, poets, musicians. Like I'm just writing about David Amram today. He's a little bit later, of course, but just that synergy of all of those artists and their thoughts and their ways of riffing off of one another made them better and better and better and changed them.
Absolutely, no question. And but even Jackson, as independent as he was, and as unusual as his mature signatures style, the drip technique was, even it had antecedents in the art that came before him. Hoffman to his constant consternation, had done a little bit of dripping of paint before Jackson did. And he was trying to constantly remind everybody that he got there first, but he didn't get there in the sort of evolved sense that Jackson did. It was sort of an incidental effect that entered into some of the paintings. And also Jackson worked with Siqueiros, the Mexican painter, in his studio. And Siqueiros was constantly trying to innovate new techniques. And one of the techniques he innovated was pouring paint on, he didn't drip it, but he poured paint on canvases on the ground. So, and actually when he was in high school, it was interesting, Pollock happened to be in high school with Phil Guston. They were classmates and friends in Los Angeles, and the teacher, a guy named Schwankowski, was really important to both of them. And he had them doing experiments where they poured paint on a flat surface and watched the way the oil paints and saw what kind of designs it could create. So even for Jackson, it wasn't completely out of his head. I mean, there were things going on that made the first time that he looked at a drip painting and realized there was something there. There were things that had happened in his life that provided a context for that realization that basically made, although he was a great painter before he did the drip painting, so the genius was there. But I think if he hadn't done the drip paintings, I'm not sure he would become the kind of overwhelming presence in the art media that he became.
I was talking to you earlier before our guests arrived about Pollock's work in the very early stages when he first started to study with Thomas Hart Benton, and the kind of I don't know, the Western feel of art that he started out with when he was working kind of in this more mural fashion. And it's astonishing to me that he evolved from that particular style of painting, which was it had a very Western feel, very, Montana, Wyoming feel to it. How he evolved from that aesthetic to where he got finally.
Well, one of the things that's interesting there is how complicated the web of interactions is and of styles is, because Benton, for all of his, I think it was his grandfather was a famous senator from Missouri, and he took on this Western persona partly as a gimmick, and that's too condescending a word, but he used it. He was a very sophisticated guy. He had been, I mean, for all of his claiming to, he once said that he didn't want to paint for museums and for the elite, and he had some nasty homophobic things to say about the audience, despite the fact that he was probably gay himself, and maybe because of it. But he had been in Paris working with Stanton McDonald Wright, the abstract artist. And in fact, Jackson's older brother, Charles, basically lived for much of his adult life on a suitcase of paintings that Benton had done in Paris that he sold off. So somehow Benton left it with Charles and he sold off. So there was no stealing involved. I mean, Benton knew what he was doing. And then he didn't think the paintings were worth anything, but they were really good abstract paintings, all of which happened before this Western art, the regionalist art, became Benton's style. In fact, if you look at some of the early paintings in that style, like the great one at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, I can't remember the full name, but Chilmark is in there. It was a cross between Stanton McDonald Wright on the one hand and Benton's more mature Western art of the future. So he was, there were, I'm sure, I'll give you an example of how useful Benton could be to him, because we interviewed at great length Harry Jackson, who was a cowboy painter. I mean, he literally lived in Wyoming. He did paintings of like John Wayne on a horse.
Yeah.
But he was very talented, and he was married to Grace Hartigan. This is how complex this.
Really?
And
Wow.
They were married on Jackson's property. And
oh my gosh.
Lee's property in East Hampton. So there's him doing this cowboy stuff, and there's Grace Hartigan, one of the great abstract expressionist painters married. So it was all very complicated. But Harry was a fantastic interview, and he talked about a long night of discussing the impact that Benton had on Pollock, and Benton organized those Western paintings according to compositional styles taken from the Italian Renaissance, and basically contrapposto and other. He used a lot of elements of Renaissance painting. In fact, even the whole style was really based. This Western style may have been Western in subject matter, but the style was pretty heavily influenced by the Italian Renaissance. And the organization of figures in a panorama of figures, which came from Tintoretto, and Pollock used it in blue poles. So you've got Tintoretto, Thomas Hart Benton, blue poles. It's quite magical how things isn't a single straight comprehensible line. The creative energy is a much more dynamic and organic and complicated magic than we might assume it would be.
Yeah, you just described a really beautiful magical journey there. In style.
You see how exciting it was
to
talk to these artists and realize that Jackson had talked about Tintoretto. So he knew. I mean, as his psychiatrist said, he may not have been able to speak articulately about Tintoretto, but he knew the art and knew the important aspects of the art and knew how to introduce those into his own painting in a way that was both original and incredibly successful.
It's like he had a visceral experience with the art. He absorbed the art.
There was a wonderful quote from somebody who lived in the village, Reuben Kadish, who was also from California and was a sculptor mostly, and was very close to Jackson. When I say that the people who knew him best weren't de Kooning and Motherwell, they were people like Reuben Kadish or Peter Busa, Conrad Marcarelli, who was slightly more famous, was quite close to him and understood him well. Nick Carone, who I think taught, I think he probably lived in the village and he died at 104, was a great, very smart guy and quite a good abstract expressionist painter. And I don't know where I was going with this, but
that's okay. We were just talking about, the absorption, the visceral, the absorption of art that came before you, and
Reuben Kadish, who also came up with the wonderful line that Jackson was a hard man to like, but an easy man to love. Which I think is a great line, and
that is great.
And he said that when Jackson looked at something, he said even something as simple as a box of matches, it was like he was the level of observational intensity was as if it was almost like it appeared to Kadish as if he was almost rearranging the atomic structure of what he was looking at. He said he never knew anyone who could observe things in the real world as intensely and viscerally, to use your very nice word, as Pollock did. And so this didn't just happen. This wasn't an accident. There was the genius was there, and the skill was there, even if it was inarticulate and anyway, it was it was articulated in a way that isn't verbal. It wasn't verbal. And it was difficult. It was, but it actually was a profound lesson for me that if you like virtually everybody in this room, I'm sure, if you spend a whole lot of time in school and you work hard and you write papers and you do well, and which virtually everybody in the room I'm sure did, you grow up thinking that academic success is a huge indicator of intellectual intelligence. And it's not necessarily true. I mean, the studying Pollock made it clear that one can understand things without processing your understanding in words.
I think it's really important for educators to remember that.
Yes.
and to nurture students so that becomes an important part of how
to try to understand what those students who may be intensely intelligent but may not do coursework terribly
Yeah.
well.
Absolutely. It's critical to remember. I'm gonna go to some questions from our audience
Okay.
first before going to some of more of my own questions that I've written out, which we've gone so much further than my original questions here. But I want to pose a question from Helen Harrison from the Pollock Krasner House. Hi,
Hi, Helen. I know Helen. When did Pollock well, what is the question from Helen?
Helen has asked, what happened to Arloy's memoir?
It's a very good question. Yes, Helen, you ought to have it. I may have a copy. I haven't gone through. Helen came to the house once and used some of the materials here. It's a great big jumble of files. I think I Xeroxed it. So if I did, I would have it, and I'd be happy to make a copy available to the Pollock Krasner Foundation.
That'd be great.
So, because it is really profound. And one thing that we did, because it was cast as a fictional account, as fiction, all the things that we thought were clearly biographical, because it was too close. There were 5 brothers. There were, it was too close. They were in Phoenix, but we still didn't want to use something from a novel, even if it was thinly disguised biography, without checking. So everything that we actually used in the book, we went back to her and said, "Did you get that from Sandy?" And only used it if she confirmed that it was a detail that Sandy had given her from their childhood together.
That's great. Yeah, really good. Good. So we're glad to put that together, Helen. I'm sure you're in touch with Helen often anyway, but that would be terrific to get that Xerox to her.
But I don't know what happened to the original. Arloy, I would have thought that Arloy would have given it to I would have thought it would have ended up with Jason McCoy, her son, and Helen would be more likely to be in touch with Jason than I am. So Jason may have the original, but I can't imagine. I think I still have the copies of the family letters, because the family gave me the letters. I went to the Xerox center, Xeroxed them, and then took them back to the family. So I don't know what happened to Frank Pollock's letters and the other members of the family who had a not insignificant correspondence.
Yeah, you were saying to me earlier before we started that they were a very close family. Am I correct about that? Yeah, yeah.
Well, how do we put close? Families are a very complicated thing.
Yeah, well, that's
I don't
true.
need to tell anybody here. So Sandy and he were intensely close, because they were the 2 closest in age, and they were together the most. And Sandy had a rather sad life. Died young basically from toxic chemical poisoning.
From painting?
No, from a war plant that he worked in during World War II. And in terms of the other families, Helen will know this at least as well as I do. Charles took care of him for a long time, or at least his wife did, but she hated him. Elizabeth, as Helen knows, I'm sure, just hated Pollock. She couldn't stop saying how often she couldn't stop talking about what a terrible person she thought, partly because she thought that Pollock was constantly taking advantage of Charles, her husband, which was certainly true. So I guess even that, I can go into all the other dynamics in the family, but just that gives you some sort of insight into the complexity. I mean, there they were taking care of Pollock. But she hated him. The wife, Charles's wife, did. And one time, Charles sold a painting, and Jackson came to Charles's apartment and grabbed an axe and sliced the painting, or put the axe through the canvas. And we think there's a chance he knew it was a painting that had sold, and Charles wasn't selling very much. So again, how close was this? And also the family was incredibly angry at Pollock, because he was doing better financially towards the end of his life than they were. I mean, they weren't selling things for $1,000. I mean, they weren't doing. I mean, Charles wasn't selling much of anything. And just to give you an insight into the family, Charles was so completely overwhelmed. As Sandy said, Jackson became a painter because Charles was a painter. And he said if Charles had been a plumber or a house painter, Jackson would have done those things. I think
Imagine
he may be
that.
a tennis player. I can't remember what the jobs were, but basically he became a painter because Charles was a painter. And Charles is the oldest, had a certain initial first place in the mother's eyes. It was so terrible for Charles, who was a much better Benton type painter. Well, actually, the early Pollock work, if you sort of don't look at it and try to see the Benton in it, you can see that there's a genius there that's, it's overwhelming. But in terms of just sort of recapitulating Benton's style, Charles was more effective at it. His drawing of the human anatomy was better than Jackson's. And all of a sudden, Jackson takes over Charles's place in the Benton Art Students League classes. He takes over Benton's place in the Benton family, and then he comes up with a style that makes doing Benton-like paintings completely unacceptable. As one of the artists told us what Benton was doing, we thought of it as just completely beyond the pale. It was sort of like creationism.
Oh, wow.
It was just something, it was intolerable in our community. And the name Pollock resonated so completely, after Life magazine, that Charles moved to Paris and briefly changed his last name so that he could climb out from under the shadow that was cast over his career by Pollock. So the family's a complicated situation.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially with someone as complicated as Jackson certainly was, and goodness knows the others were maybe even partially as complicated because of their family situation. But yeah.
Oh, I was going to say that Jackson basically didn't contribute to the mother's upkeep. I mean, when at the end of her life, she had no income. Basically, there was some sort of check that she got from other members of the family, and they talked about the mother and Arloy racing to the mailbox to grab the check because Arloy needed it just to feed the family and to feed their mother-in-law. And there was Jackson, who was doing pretty well and was sort of bragging about his new tweed jacket, and there's the family saying, if you can buy a new tweed jacket, why aren't you contributing to mom's care? So there was a lot of resentment in the family about that.
Yeah, I can understand that. I'm gonna flip to another question.
Sure.
So did you have any preconceived notions or ideas about Jackson Pollock that changed after you did your research?
Let me ponder that. I don't know that I can review my knowledge of him and our research well enough to give you a profound answer, but what was really helpful was that even though I had studied art history at Princeton and then at Harvard, and I actually did my master's paper on Jackson Pollock, although I don't think there was any real connection between doing that and picking Jackson as a topic for the biography. But Greg, who actually understood art incredibly well and ended up as his principal accomplishment writing these two biographies of an artist, didn't come out of art academics. So he was able to look at things much more freshly than I did. For example, and I don't know what Helen will think of this, but it's in the book. Greg read Greenberg and Rosenberg, and coming out of Princeton, where they were sort of gods, they were the Bible to me. I mean, I read them with about as much dispassion as a religious scholar reading the Bible. Greg reads them like a lawyer and says, "This is utter nonsense in many cases," and so it was interesting to, and it really helped that he looked at things from a different perspective. I mean, I think both of our perspectives end up in the book, but And even it was really helpful that Greg wasn't that much of a fan at the beginning. I mean, by the time we finished the book, he was, blown away. But, he sort of came at Pollock without, he hadn't really looked at him that carefully when we began the book. So in a way, Greg wrote the book. I mean, I did the research and I drafted things, but he did most of the writing. I think one of the reasons he's able to explain the drip technique, which he does beautifully, is that he had to explain it to himself first.
Oh,
He had to sort of understand it personally before he could then write about it for an audience. So I think it was hugely important that it was a little bit of a clean slate when he began.
yeah, that's really interesting, coming at it with the two of you from completely different perspectives to come together with a whole new idea about this. From Roy Burkhead, another of our guests, Roy says, I enjoyed the book a great deal. While reading the last 100 pages or so, I was cheering for Pollock to turn things around and have another great period, but I knew how it would end.
Well, it is one of the problems there. Well, thank you for that comment, Mr. Burkhardt. It means one nice thing about writing these two books, even though both sold reasonably well, every single person who read it carefully was a joy for Greg and me, knowing that somebody, because they're so long, it takes an investment. And one of the sad things is that Pollock, because he was sort of cast as this great innovator, he came up with this terrible idea that every painting had to be its own new thing. Well, very few people, I mean, if you look at Blue Poles and at Easter in the Totem and the other paintings towards the end of his life, it's as if he refused to repeat himself. Well, very few painters have so many original new ideas that they can sort of reconceive the whole act of making a painting from scratch with every new canvas. So the challenge to himself, in addition to the fact that he was falling apart mentally and physically, was just overwhelming. And de Kooning didn't have any problem. And then there are groups of paintings, and it doesn't lessen the importance of each one of them, that they are part of a group. And I think it's called the Landscape series, which includes Ruth Zowie and Park Rosenberg, which are among my favorite of his paintings. And the organization of the space, the thickness of the brushwork, even the palette of blue and brown is common among most of those paintings. In some ways, it's exciting that you can look at one painting in the context of the next one, and at the end, and Jackson just couldn't do it, and I think that made it difficult. But it would have been. We felt the same way about Van Gogh, who died even younger. And if you look at what Van Gogh was doing at the end of his life, it was overwhelming, because they were becoming so abstract. I mean, there's a landscape at the National Gallery in Washington that you can sort of see the landscape, but it's really this sort of abstract painting. And there were drawings that Vincent did at the end where you can't even see what the canvas or what the drawing is about. It's just great mark making on paper. And so it's sad, as Mr. Burkhardt said about Pollock, with regard to Van Gogh, you think, my God, if he'd lived 2 more years, what would he have done?
What would he have done? Yeah. Pollock too, I wonder, what would he have
and
done?
Pollock too.
We won't know.
The genius was still there.
Yeah. We have a guest from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil tonight, amongst other places around the world, I'm sure. But Camilla says she wonders about the process of painting and how long did Pollock take to finish a painting. I guess that varied, but could he interrupt the process of a painting and then come back to it, or did he do this in a continual flow?
Well, one of the things that came up, people in this room may know that Greg and I surmise, although we're more and more convinced with each new forensic expert that we encounter, that Van Gogh didn't kill himself. It was sort of the great discovery in that in that book. But a lot of scholars who just used the phrase Van Gogh's killed himself a million times in their prose, have had trouble with it. You know, we believed the story that Pollock created the Guggenheim mural basically overnight. Our source for that was Lee Krasner, who was in the apartment when he was doing it. She was a good storyteller, and she was when I said earlier she wasn't verbal, I take that back. I'm actually wrong on that one too, because she could be quite verbal, but not in a kind of academic way. She could be quite funny, and she anyway, there was a reason for telling the story that way. It's a much more dramatic story, and unfortunately, I guess the best scene in the Pollock movie, where he unfolds this canvas and he can't figure out what to do with it, and then overnight he just sort of creates this masterpiece. It's a much better story. But they went for conservation to the Getty Conservation Laboratory for like a year, and they did studies of it, and they figured out that he did it over quite a few months, because they could tell from the paint and cores that they took from it that this wasn't done overnight. It wasn't done, I mean, it was done relatively quickly for a great big painting like that, but it was by no means overnight. And so one of the things you have to do as a writer is sort of come to terms with the fact that new information will emerge that may undercut something you've written. It's painful, but it's important.
It is important, of course, and you're a generous enough writer and intellect to go ahead and accept that and say, well, you know what, so things were discovered since. So yeah, that's really cool. We have a last question. We're going to wrap up real quick here. This has been fantastic, and I could go on all night because it's really, really great. So thank you. But I'm gonna change up this question a little bit. Camilla also asks, is there a connection between Pollock and John Cage? But I want to add to that question and ask you if you know what sort of musical, what did he listen to? What were?
As I recall, reasonably clearly, again, Helen would know, I'm sure. I think it was jazz mostly.
Jazz.
Which is not uninteresting relative to the paintings, you know, because the sort of riffing and the spontaneity of it, and the sort of creating it as you go along, and it was the right music for that period. But a guy named Morton Feldman, who did a kind of modern music, it was arranged with. As Helen is saying, yes, jazz, but no, I lost.
Not in the studio. So it seems like Helen was saying, that he listened to jazz, but he didn't listen.
But not in the studio.
Are we interpreting that right, Helen?
That makes sense. Yeah, I don't remember hearing that he played music while he was painting. I didn't mean that. I mean that, because I thought that your question was really what kind of music did he listen to when he was listening?
What did he love? What I'm just, I always wonder. I don't think he liked bebop. That's one thing that I recall from my readings. He wasn't a fan of bebop like Charlie Parker or whatever, but I was just wondering if anyone knew what, and did he have a relationship with John Cage at all? Did he know John Cage?
I don't believe so, but again, Helen will know. She does this all the time and has been doing it for decades. My mind has been out of the Pollock world for 20, 30 years. So I don't remember, I can say this, I don't remember any indication that they knew each other, although maybe they ran into each other. But he didn't, it was sort of like some of his most famous comments were from interviews that he did, for example, for a radio program, where the answers were written for him by someone else.
Oh, really?
Robert Motherwell, in one case, Helen is saying earlier jazz, and Cage didn't like him or his art.
Oh, that's good. Thank you, Helen. We should have had you here too, Helen. I'm sorry about that. Next time we do this, we're going to have an evening with both you and Helen.
That would be delightful.
That would be really fantastic.
Anyway, so you can tell. In fact, it's sort of embarrassing that Pollock didn't write all those answers himself, and he didn't come up with the titles of the paintings. And as I recall, Clement Greenberg came up with quite a few of the titles.
Is that true? Wow.
So one of the paintings, if I recall this correctly, is Pacify, and it just seemed weird to Greg and me that Pollock even knew who he was, but as I recall, Greenberg came up with the title. So what's really funny is watching art historians try to understand the myth and its relationship to the subject matter, and then realizing it just had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Well, this has been just a rich and wonderful conversation, and we're already at 7:05. I don't want to impose upon your time any longer, Steve. It's just been great, but I want to make a date with you and Helen.
Oh, it would be really exciting to talk to Helen, because she knows this subject so deeply, and she would also be more aware of recent discoveries in Pollock literature than I am. During the writing of Van Gogh, we didn't have a whole lot of time to keep up with what was happening anyway, I've had a great pleasure. Sorry, I've had a cough for some time now, and I apologize for that.
Hope you feel better. Get some water. And we've had a great time with you tonight, Steve. Thank you so much for your knowledge and for sharing it with us. And I look forward to next year. We're gonna meet again with Helen and have a really wonderful discussion again.
Yeah, let's do that. And thank you guys for inviting me to participate in this event. And preserving Greenwich Village is a terrific and important responsibility. And so I'm very grateful that you invited me to be on this program.
Well, the honor is all ours, and thank you. We take our business very seriously, and we by illuminating the stories of great villagers and everyday villagers, we help to sort of keep the stories alive and why it's important to preserve the village. So thank you so very, very much.
Good night, everyone.
And thanks everybody for being here with us. Thank you, Hugh, for all your amazing assistance. And I'm signing off, and I wish you all a very healthy and wonderful evening. Good night. Thanks.
Bye-bye.